All right, here we are live. So today we're talking to Joey Gamble, former Navy corpsman, turned software engineer, and to talk to him about his transition from military life into civilian life into the tech field. So, Joey Gamble, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your background is and what's going on with you right now?
Yeah, Chris. Um, so I got out of the Navy back in 2021, July. Loved it. I was a corpsman for 6.5 years. Didn't do anything crazy, but I enjoyed it. Thought I wanted to do healthcare on the way out. So I started nursing school about 6 months before I got out as well. Rolled right into that. It was fine going back to school. A little bit of a transition, but yeah, it worked out pretty well. Probably about a year into it, realized all the experience I had as a corpsman didn't really mean anything. It didn't transitioned into school certificates. It didn't make me any better. I still do the same tests, do the same things that everybody else did. I had a slight leg up, maybe in some of the hands-on experience, and maybe some of the educational parts, but didn't really set me aside. And I didn't really feel like I wanted to do healthcare for 35 more years. Um, Not that being a corpsman kind of burnt me out of healthcare, but it opened my eyes into like a little bit of a little bit of healthcare and different experiences and what that would be like for the next 30 years. So I kind of explored my options. I think I talked to you about it. I talked to some other friends and like that did software,
Yeah.
cybersecurity, back end, and I landed at front end development at the time. So I looked into a boot camp that thankfully took my GI Bill, but there were several others that I was looking at too. Um, and did my boot camp. Came out pretty well after a few months and landed a job. Um, Thankfully, having the security clearance I had, I think helped me a little bit with that, and kind of got my feet wet. On the job training was much better than the boot camp, obviously, but it did help me. And 2 years later, here I am. I've had a few different jobs in that time frame, but and starting a new one soon. But yeah, that was just my transition in the last few years. So.
Very cool. So, from your perspective, what was the hardest part about transitioning from the Navy into civilian life?
For me, it was maybe not for me and maybe for everybody, but for me, it was you kind of get told what to do. It's like bowling with the bumpers on. It's like you can hit the pins, but with the bumpers are on, people are telling you what to do. People are telling you where to go. It's a little easy. When you get out, the bumpers come down. You're on your own. If you fall flat on your face, there's nothing there to protect you. You're in civilian life now. So, not like, breaking the law, but hey, if you lose your job, there's no more job security.
No.
There's no more steady paychecks because your contract is still going. So for me, it was kind of like just those bumpers coming down, and there was no training wheels anymore. So that was probably the most jarring realization after getting out. But other than that, I had gone to school before. I had that job, and I was a little older at the time when I got out. I was, 27, 26.
6.
So, but there's guys that get out at 22. They come in at 18 and 22, and you come out if it might have been a whole different thing if I did that. At 22, it's life comes at you fast. It still comes at you fast at almost 30. So.
Very cool. So, tell us a little bit about how did your experience in the Navy prepare you for a career in software engineering? I know you're a corpsman, and a lot of your experience was focused around healthcare, but maybe talk about some soft skills or even some technical, maybe some of the harder skills even that you learned in the Navy that has transitioned well into civilian life and into your software career.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is a lot of soft skills you learn, and really that comes with time with any job. But in the military, you're you're forced to. I wouldn't say forced. That makes it sound bad, but you're working with all kinds of people. From different backgrounds, different areas of life. There's people that are the same age as you that are you're giving orders to. There's people older than you. or younger than you, giving you orders. So it kind of gives you that perspective of it doesn't matter who you work with, it doesn't matter what the job is, but it gives you experience kind of a little bit everywhere, in that aspect of speaking to people, working with people, and those soft skills definitely transitioned over. Um, in tech, I've heard, it is about what you know, but it's also about how you can interact with people. There's people that can code, they're geniuses, but they don't speak well with the client, or they don't work well with others. And that's a huge thing. If you have a team of 5, 10, or even 2, I've been on a team of 2. If I don't work well with that other person, then it's going to be hard getting things done. So those soft skills in the military definitely helped me a lot, talking to different people, getting that confidence, talking to people in places of higher power, not necessarily power in tech, but like the hierarchy of the job, like your manager's manager, the client. And you may not have to talk directly to those people sometimes, but talking to the client can be a big deal because they're the ones pumping money into your project, and you need to say the right things or not say the things that they don't need to hear. So it helped me definitely in that aspect. Hard skills, not as much because, it's healthcare. Although at my first job, my boss was a little older. He was like in his 80s, maybe the late 70s. And, having knowledge of how to use an AED did come up at one point. So that hard skill might have helped. But
Yeah.
as far as hard skills with the technology part, not really. But soft skills definitely. So.
That makes sense. Yeah, you never know when you're going to need to use an AED in the workplace. That's actually an important skill, believe it or not. That's especially when you're in office. It's hopefully when you're not in the office and you're working from home, it's not a skill you need very often. But yeah, that's awesome. And I'll say for our audience, those soft skills, leadership, being able to communicate well, being able to express very technical things in a very layman, easy to understand manner is sometimes not just a little bit important, but maybe in some cases a little bit more important, especially as you're entering the workforce, than the harder skills. Because I tell people all the time, I could teach people skills. It's much more difficult to teach people how to communicate well and how to relate to other people and how to, you know, have a conversation, just have a normal everyday conversation and have a personality that's going to fit well with the group that you're getting ready to walk into. So it having a passion to learn and a passion for continuous education and continuous learning sometimes will outweigh your deficit in some of the harder skills. So
Definitely.
speaking of that, tell us a little bit about what inspired you to pursue software engineering after leaving the Navy. You talked a little bit about it. Tell us a little bit more about what excites you about it. What is something that really gets you going about it?
So before I kind of got into it at all, I'd seen friends like succeed in software. It's all in different areas, but and then I looked into it and saw the growth. How big the field of tech is. It's ever expanding. It's also difficult to get into. But I saw sometimes the challenge is kind of inspiring. Like you're like, I could do this. And that was part of it. I didn't have a chip on my shoulder or anything to prove to anybody, but I wanted to get into something that, if it's worth doing, it's going to be hard. So, but I saw like you and others with success in tech, and I kind of looked into it and saw how really, visually you can create anything, from the front end perspective. And that really caught my eye. Like you can make you can make the web pages so interactive, you can make applications, you can make anything. And I saw kind of the potential in that, and obviously others have, but the potential in what I could do, what I could be able to do. down the line. And that kind of inspired me. And before I even considered software, I was kind of fond of biomedical engineering. And
Okay.
that's more of a crossover between healthcare and more like that's more hardware. But the software that in those machines is also very intuitive and genius if you think about it. And that's kind of what inspired me to get into software a little bit, and seeing you do so well. But I think that's what kind of led me down the road, and now it's panned out pretty well. Um, but I've got a long way to go, and the field is going to change dramatically, I'd say, in the next 10, 20 years. So we'll see. But
Cool.
it is inspiring to try and keep up. So
It is. It is. So tell us a bit about how did you manage learning new technical skills while adapting to civilian life, moving from the military into civilian life, and kind of what that transition looked like for you?
yeah, so for me, I'm not going to say it was easier by any means, but having the GI Bill definitely helped out, because that kind of gave me a little bit of leeway with finances. Using the GI Bill, I didn't have to pay for the boot camp, so that kind of helped me clear up other areas like of finances. I also, my now wife Emma, she was working when I went to school, and then before she was going to school when I was working, so that also helps out. But there are people that do it on their own. There's people that go to school and take out loans while they go to school and come out with success. And some people in some situations may have to do that, because some of those boot camps are a little more expensive. But for me, I was very fortunate that I had a lot of things lined up. But it shouldn't stop anybody. If you really wanted to do it, you may have to take out a little loan or work a job while you do the boot camp. And some of those boot camps are not as invasive with your time. Like some are 40 hours a week, and some are kind of at your own pace. I would say picking the right one is difficult, because if it fits your lifestyle, then that's the one for you. It's not about you know some of them have a good rapport, but some like with the job force, and some of them don't. And some job places don't want to hear about your boot camp at all. They want you to have experience, and they don't care about where you got it from. So
Right.
that was probably for me a little easier transitioning. It was still hard, the thought of failing and having to start over or go back to nursing school or do something else entirely, go work at the grocery store until I figure out what I want to do. That's it's daunting to try and you know figure out or fail, but you have to fail, and figure out. So
So it kind of going along with that, tell me a bit about imposter syndrome for you going into this career change. I mean, that going from healthcare type roles into a you know tech role must have been a little, like you said, a little bit daunting.
yeah,
Uh, tell us about how you have experienced imposter syndrome and kind of how you've been able to push through it.
yeah. So I still face imposter syndrome. It's to a lesser degree now, but it definitely happens. When I first started, I was working. I worked for Border Patrol on a contract. I was a front end developer at the time, and I was working with guys that were physicists or had masters in whatever. And at the time, I didn't have a degree, so I kind of thought that would kind of set me back. I didn't have any experience. When I asked people questions, in my head, I'm like, I should know this. This sounds so dumb, and that is imposter syndrome, right? So
Mhm.
they already hired you for the job. They knew your skill set, or you lied about it, which you shouldn't have. But
Right.
um, I didn't lie. They saw that I was teachable. I wanted to learn, but in my head, I'm like, I'm not cut out for this. They hired the wrong guy. Um, I should be doing this a lot faster. Look at the guy over there. He's churning out, a whole application himself. But that guy, he had a computer science degree. He's been doing this for 4 years. He was, a smart guy. What's to say I couldn't be the same in 4 years? And it's easy to do to yourself in any profession. I'd say, I'd say doctors even sometimes probably face it, or nurses, or going back to healthcare. There's probably guys in every career field that face that. But because I didn't have a degree, because I didn't have that skill set on paper, I felt as though I wasn't good enough. And that was through the first job. Second job, I kind of felt that to a lesser degree. Still kind of faced it because it was a smaller team. I had a UX UI. I was working a new framework, Angular at the time, never touched it. So that, a huge barrier for me or obstacle for me learning that. But thankfully, my PM project manager at the time was super helpful, super, calmed me down about a lot of stuff. And then in my last role, it was a team of me and one other guy, so I had to talk directly to the client all the time and all this stuff. But it comes with experience. That imposter syndrome will wear off. Or maybe you'll feel it to a lesser degree. I don't know if you do, you still or not, but
yeah,
for me,
I think there are still days after 25 years of doing this that I still think I have no idea what I'm doing. So it's we all have those days, even after you've been doing it for a long time. There's still days where you're doing something and just nothing nothing's succeeding, and you run your code and keeps on failing, and you're like, I don't know what the heck I'm doing here. So even those of us that have been in our roles for a long time still experience imposter syndrome. And so it's I talk about one, understanding, don't compare yourself to somebody that's been in the career for 25, 30 years, first of all. Second of all, build a relationship with those people that have been in the career for a long time. Build a community of people that are in either the role that you're in or similar roles, at least in the same kind of in the same field, and being able to have those discussions of, hey, I've experienced this is what's going on with me, and somebody else being like, oh my god, I've gone through the same thing like yesterday, and today's so much better. And just knowing that other people experience it sometimes is a huge help. So very cool. I just want to say, for those of you that are in the audience, if you do have any specific questions for Joey, be sure to pop them in the chat, and we'll get to them. But we'll continue on here. So tell me a little bit about what's been the biggest challenge in your software engineering journey so far?
I would say the biggest thing is learning on the job. So in my boot camp, we learned React, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, which are all things in front end. On the job, I learned back end coding. I learned Python a little bit, during the job, on the job, learning SQL queries on the job, learning where things are in your code base, which, anybody coming to a new job would happen. They kind of give you some leeway on time, getting up to speed on the code base, putting in PRs or pull requests or whatever. But the hardest part is learning on the job. And for instance, in my last role, it was just me and one other guy. He was a data analyst. And I, at the time, was just front end with a little back end experience and no database experience. And through that year of working with just him, we both learned, how to make an API, how to, do the back end queries. We had to fix applications. We had to fix the SQL queries and applications. We had to run ad hoc reports for, the client at any given time. Could have been at any time during the week. There were times after work you get a call because, not to, make it sound important, but Congress needs these numbers from Border Patrol.
Yep.
Why? What are we doing? I've got plans. These numbers cannot be that important.
Yep.
But before that, it's like, hey, can you get this done? It's like it might as well have been a different language because I had never seen it before, how to do something. So you go down the rabbit hole of, Stack Overflow or teaching yourself or YouTube and what's the other one? Coursera. I think that's
Hmm.
what it is. Yeah. So that's the hardest thing, and struggling to kind of learn that in a short time frame, because when somebody tells you they need something, a day goes by, 2 days go by, you're like, hey, can you get this to me? It's like, I can at the beginning of next week, if that, that's fine. It's like, okay. Sometimes people just want a timeline. If you don't give them any updates, they're like in the dark. um, or you just tell them like straight up, hey, I don't know this, I'm learning it, but I'll get it to you. And that was a hard thing for me to just tell people that I don't know something. And that comes with imposter syndrome too.
Hmm.
Don't fake it. Don't fake it. Don't lie. Don't say you know something, because they'll see right through it when they see your code or see you try and do it. So um, that was the hardest thing for me, is learning new things on the job.
Yeah. Yeah. Communication, going back to what we talked about earlier, communication is super important in any field probably, but definitely in our field. And sometimes people will ask something and it feels urgent, like the way that they come across or maybe the word choices that they use. But give people a timeline and then they'll either adjust your timeline and give you more urgent and a more urgent timeline, or they'll let you know, oh yeah, that works. I'm good with that. And all of a sudden it seems less urgent and less uh, earth shattering than it may have when they first, mentioned the request. So yeah, communication super important. The other thing I want to touch on there that you mentioned was, when you entered into the career field, into the field, you know, learning the code base and learning kind of the flow of how things go.
Yeah.
Um, that's something that you experience probably every time you change jobs, right? I mean, every time you go into something, a new contract or a new company, the flow could be a little bit different for that company, right? Code base, the flow of how PRs work, who puts in tickets, whether you're using Jira or ADO or whatever the case may be for
Yeah.
your ticketing system. Um, all those things can change from job to job. Understand that they'll be comparable, probably, right? Is your experience that they're pretty comparable so far for the things that you've done?
Uh,
Maybe not the code base piece, but at least the flow of like PRs and tickets.
Going from the first one, so the first one they didn't do tickets when I first got there. They started implementing tickets. Second one, they had a UI guy, they had a UX person. We had other devs, we had a tech lead, we had a PM, we had a what do they call them? They are exclusively just for ticketing systems and setting meetings. I forget what they're called. Scrum Master.
Okay. Yeah, Scrum Masters, yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I had never had one before, so they'll do all that for you. We'll do, we'll do weekly meetings, we'll do tickets, we'll break down like what went wrong, what went right, what did we like, stories, all this stuff. And then when I got from that job to the last one, where it was just me and one other guy, it kind of felt like cowboy coding, where we were just, hey man, I got to put in this PR so we can get this applications running because it's broken. Can you look at it? Okay, yeah, I'll look at it. And then like it's like, hey, it looks good. Okay, push it, and just straight to production. And it was like, did you look at it? Yeah, it looks good. But he doesn't know front end, or like we both kind of did our own back end stuff, and it was like, yeah, I think it looks good.
The-
Push
the- there's nothing as terrifying as your one your first push to prod, right? Nothing nearly as terrifying as that first time you do it in general, and uh, or doing something, a hot fix in prod
it.
because something's broken and it's Friday afternoon, and all of a sudden you're pushing something to prod on a Friday afternoon, and that's the mortal sin of devs, right? Is pushing to prod on Friday afternoon.
Don't do
So
that. I'm not trying to work this weekend. Don't do that. Not right.
right.
Um, yeah. So especially with applications, or like applications that are already live, that people are using even
Yeah.
on the weekends. Yeah, like with Border Patrol, or the other one when I worked on a Mantech project. Yeah, they had applications being used by guys weekend, night, day, they could not go down. Or you were getting a nasty email. So a few nasty emails. So
yeah. That's the risk of pushing the prod on a Friday afternoon, is that, like you said, you'll be working over the weekend, because you will get those emails and those phone calls of, hey, whatever you pushed is broken. We need you to either undo it or fix it, like now. And all of a sudden you're jumping off of whatever enjoyable time that you had back into work. So yeah, that's why we don't push the prod on Fridays as devs, right? Do not do it. Awesome.
So
I see we've got a few new people. If you do have any questions, be sure to pop them into chat. We're talking here to former Navy Corpsman Joey Gamble, who is now a software engineer. So you work contract work primarily, right?
primarily, yeah. Actually, yeah, exclusively. It kind of feels like.
So tell us a little bit about maybe the uncertainty of being a contractor, or maybe kind of the pros and cons that you feel being doing contract work as opposed to maybe being a W-2 employee.
So for me, I actually have a really good example, but I'll start out with where it began. So contracting, from what I know, versus maybe consulting or W-2 or part-time, and you do multiple things, or maybe freelance, is you're doing one thing the whole time. So let's say in the contract, you're doing, for instance, an application for Congress, or maybe some other government entity, some other three-letter whatever entity, and you're just stuck on that one application the whole time. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room, like, hey, I don't like this application, can I switch to a different team? Or it's something like that. Your contract may only do that one application, and you're doing that the whole time. Whereas in consulting, for instance, like Booz Allen or Deloitte, they have so many different projects, so many different teams. They have so much manpower and money that they can afford to move people around. Or you may only touch a project for 6 months to a year to churn out an application, and you're doing something new, which is it's a lot higher paced environment. From what I've heard, I don't know firsthand, but in contracting, it can be really slow. And I've worked on really slow projects and really fast projects. So I've worked on projects that are just maintaining applications and churning out a new application, in 6 months to a year from now. Then I've worked on applications that, hey, the executive director needs a new application that does this, and it needs to be done in 3 months. And you're like, I have one other guy on my team. Okay, we'll work on it. That's all you can really say. And you're working every day on the same thing. Whereas W-2, I don't actually know too much about W-2, but freelance, you kind of, it's harder. The money's probably not as consistent unless you're really good. And you have to take what you can get. But being in contracts, actually, my last job, the contract ended. It wasn't that, we weren't doing good enough work. It's that the government didn't re-up the contract. They decided not to renew it. So you had an expiration date. And if your contractor doesn't have any more work for you, you have an expiration date on your job. So that's where I was. And then, 8 or 9 interviews later, even with 2 years of experience, it took me 2 months to find this other job. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. I cannot turn that off. Yes, I can. Thought I had my ringer off on my phone. It's on the laptop, and
you're good.
Oh, no.
You're good. All right. Well, and also data analyst roles. So I'm gonna show this, and we'll talk about this for a second. But so you've done some back end work, right? Even as a software engineer, as a front end, back end dev, you've touched SQL, and you've touched Python. what's your, I mean, I'd like your perspective as well here. What do you think, especially in government contract roles, what do you think the future of data engineering and analysts are, that you see kind of working contracts and working, in app development?
So, I don't know that I have too much experience with that because in one of my roles it was fine, and I got to turn this off.
You're,
In
you're
one
fine.
of my roles, I couldn't even touch it. Couldn't touch the database, couldn't touch any backend. And then other ones, we were doing a lot of data analyst roles. As far as like what the future will be, I think AI is going to help out a lot. I don't think it's going to take it over by any means. I think it's going to help out, and it's going to be a huge tool for people to use. Just like, Stack Overflow is a huge tool. The internet is a huge tool. Calculators didn't take jobs from mathematicians, you know.
They
So
just sped up their job, right?
exactly. It might lead to less people in the workforce, maybe because it'll make a job that was harder, requiring 3 to 4 people, maybe a little easier. So it only takes 1 to 2 people. Um, I don't
Maybe.
know. I don't know how well that may pan out. I know employers can be cheap, and they
Yeah.
try and get full stack devs or full fledged software engineers to do way more work than they should be doing, as opposed to hiring 2 to 3 people for a job.
And I'll
Um,
say that,
that's
uh,
definitely
sorry, I'll say that happens in data careers as well. It's, you all of a sudden, instead of being a data engineer, you're the data guy, right? You cover everything from, this happened a lot early in my career. I was everything from a DBA all the way through, the data analyst, and had everything in between. So and I've heard from other people that it the pendulum's starting to swing back in that direction where all of a sudden you're multiple different roles. You're having to swap a lot of hats. Just like you said, in software engineering, you all companies want somebody that is very versatile, very able to adapt and move from one piece to another within that life cycle of what they're doing. So I think that the future of data engineering and data analysis is going back in that direction, even flowing into some data science stuff. Uh, just like Joey, you're saying with software engineering, people want that full stack
yeah,
of experience, of ability to, uh, in order to save money as a company, as
yeah,
far as employment cost goes, and also in order to uh have that versatility and that breadth of skill. And one person can help, even if they're not directly touching every single piece of that on their own, they're at least able to flex a little bit from one place to another.
right, yeah,
Having those skills, and developing those skills in those job, when you get those experiences, I think are super important, especially in the kind of in the environment that we're in right now with the tech layoffs and things that are going on there. um, you'll notice that, I think as you continue your career, and for those of you in the audience that are continuing your career, you'll notice that as you know there are layoffs, it that work is still needed. They're just having to either, you know, take the people that are currently still in the roles and overworking them, or you'll start to find out that all of a sudden there are these tech layoffs, but then they start hiring some contractors or doing some consulting so that they are supplementing it, because companies can let go of contractors and consultants without it hitting their shareholders, and their shareholders really seeing what's going on there. So those kinds of things happen. Um, so you'll always see that pendulum kind of swinging back and forth. But as far as what those uh, roles are for brand new people entering the career field, I think it's important to make sure that you're open minded as far as what your role is going to be and what roles you're applying for.
yeah,
You know, don't narrow your focus to things that are titled software engineer or data engineer or data analyst, and be sure that you're looking out for things like an ETL developer or a front end developer or back end developer, depending on which kind of focus that you're looking at. But be sure that you're looking out for all those different things, and make sure that as you do get a job and are in the career field, where there are opportunities to spread your wings a little bit and venture a little bit into an adjacent uh, career field, go ahead and do that. That's great experience.
You may be doing one thing and you get your feet wet in a different area and you're like, wow, I really like this more than the job I had. Can I do this? Or maybe you get to do it a little bit and you enjoy kind of doing both instead of just one all the time. So that's why I liked being, a software engineer, because I get to wear different hats. I do like doing just front end or back end, but wearing multiple also kind of, it makes you well-rounded, in the job field, but also kind of breaks up that monotony of just doing one thing all the time. So,
yeah. Very cool. Thank you, Vincent. All right. Let's see what else we have here. What has been one of the biggest resources that you've used in your career journey for your learning purposes?
I think it's called Coursera. I think we talked about that earlier. Coursera was huge when I first started. And you kind of, because Coursera is really cool with some, I don't, not advertising here, but they'll teach with you, or they'll teach you as you go, and they even have the files that you can download and code along with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was really helpful for me, at least. So, yeah, I used to think I was a visual learner. I'm not. I need to repeat and try it and do it hands-on. I thought I could look at a board and be like, oh yeah, I know this. Yeah. No, I need to code and actually put experience in, or hands-on experience with that. At least for me, because just seeing it is not the same. I don't retain it that well. But Coursera really helped out. Stack Overflow is always going to be a resource. And then as of recently, in the last year, ChatGPT or AI has kind of helped out a lot. It's not perfect by any means, but let's say you forget the syntax or how to write something. And I think we've talked about this too. Maybe you forget how to write a query that could be really simple, but your brain is fried with whatever's been going on for the last 2 weeks on whatever project, and you're like, let me just look this up real quick. Instead of spending 5 minutes on Stack Overflow, you can spend 10 seconds in ChatGPT, and it'll jog your memory or give you similar syntax to what you need. It is not perfect by any means, but it gets you close. So
it does. And I think it's really good for that type of scenario where you've forgotten syntax, right? And I'll say that syntax can be, especially for SQL, can be a little different from from Oracle to SQL Server to Postgres. Even something as simple as the order in which you put your variables into your date diff, right? It is different from one syntax of one version of SQL to another. So sometimes you forget that. Even after 25 years, sometimes you forget the order of that you need to put in there. And like you said, ChatGPT, it's instant. You've got it in a second. You could tell it this is which flavor of SQL that I'm working with. This is the function that I'm looking up, and it'll tell you immediately, as opposed to trying to fish through some Stack Overflow responses. So yeah, that's a good one. Again, if anybody has any questions, be sure to pop them in the chat. So what advice would you give to veterans or those in the military who want to pursue a tech career?
I would say use all the resources that you have. Don't try and do it yourself right out of the way, like right out of the gate. There are other resources. There's other veterans in similar situations or similar, career paths that helped out. There was when I first started, I looked at all the resources I had. At the time, there was this program called Vet Tech, I don't know if it's still being used. I think maybe that it was a test, for a few years they tested it out. Uh, it was basically just a GI Bill for boot camps kind of deal. Um, but if you have your GI Bill, use that. If you have your Montgomery GI, use that. There's different groups in LinkedIn. There's vet groups all over LinkedIn that can probably lead you in the right direction. And then also, what else was I thought there was another helpful. Yeah, you don't do it all yourself. Look into your other resources that you have. Maybe reach out to your like vets on Facebook. There's groups on there too that do the same thing. It's called Vets in Tech, I think, is the LinkedIn program.
Yeah.
And they were really helpful. I had already started my boot camp then, so that wasn't necessary. But they'll also try and help you kind of find a job. And there was a mentorship program, actually. It was for veterans. That's what it was. I think it was called ACP or something. I'd have to look it back up, but I was paired with he was a back-end engineer. I was paired with him for 1 year. Um, you don't have to pay anything. Don't pay a dime. You talk with them as often as you want. At the very minimum, you speak once a month. It can be anything. You could just talk with them about your personal life, but you can talk with them about, hey, what helped you, when you first got in the career field? Hey, this is my resume. Can you help me out with that? Can I see your resume? How do you think, should I apply for this role? I'm going to send it to you. And that's what I did. He was great. He gave me perspective on back end. He worked for CrowdStrike. Super, super smart guy. And it was so funny because he told me, he's like, if 50% of a job posting has what you have on your resume, apply for it. The worst they're going to say is no, but don't lie if they ask you something, right? Don't put on your resume, Oracle, or I know how to set up. I don't know how to set up like a cloud, base. What, I don't know, but yeah, don't lie and put it on there just so you can apply. But if you have like close to what that job posting's asking for, apply.
Yeah.
And it was funny because I applied and he was like, oh, well, let me know how it works out. And I was probably, I think, 4 months into speaking with him and I got a job. That was the first one. But I was also willing to go into the office. That's a big thing for those, trying to get into it. Don't keep shooting for that at-home role. You might get it, but they're very competitive. Even guys that have been in the field years, they're still shooting for those at-home roles. And some of them are willing to take a pretty substantial pay cut just to work from home as opposed to going into the office, which is happening now. People are getting forced to go into the office and they don't want to, and they're willing to take a pay cut because they don't want to. So
it's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, I think it's super important to make sure that don't limit your job perspectives by being only targeting remote jobs. It's especially for people just getting into it. I think it's super important to broaden your perspective there. There's something else that you touched on then too. The comment about, as long as you fit like half of the job requirements, apply for it. I think that's super important and a great message for people just getting into the field, even for people that have been in the field for a long time. I've read recently that something around 90% of women won't apply for a job if they don't fit every one of the criteria, and I think that's true for some men as well.
Yeah.
If you fit 50, 60, 70% of the job roles, the job role, and you just don't fit it as a whole, let the company decide whether you're a good fit or not. We mentioned earlier the soft skills of having that excitement and enthusiasm for learning
Mhm.
can really outweigh not having a specific skill, a specific hard skill. So having those soft skills and being able to communicate, being able to have that passion for learning will go a long way. Like you're saying, Joe.
No, yeah,
I
definitely.
But that's super important. For those of you that are just joining, this is Joey Gamble, former Navy corpsman turned software engineer. And if you have any specific questions for either him or I, just pop them in the chat. We're open books, happy to answer whatever we can answer. But I just want to say thank you, Joe. For those comments, because I think that coming from me, that has been in the tech field for 25 years, it's one thing, but for a more fresher type person that is more recently getting into the field, I think it carries a little bit more weight for those people out in the audience that may be just getting into the field as well. It's one thing, yeah. It's like hearing a parent tell you, "Oh, hey, you should really do this," and then versus having a peer or a friend tell you,
Yeah.
"Hey, that's a great idea," and all of a
You're
sudden you
right.
can
It
hear it.
is.
Yeah. Um,
But just to touch on that a little bit more, I still remember my first job like it was yesterday. I thought I had food poisoning like the day before.
I heard about
I
it.
was in a full suit and everybody else was like in just like a shirt, like a button-up shirt, I think tie. But I was in a full suit. I was so nervous. I was sweating bullets. The guy that was interviewing me, there were two guys. One of them was a back-end engineer and one of them was a physicist, a full-fledged software engineer, and asking me questions about recursion and scaling a tree and all this. And I was like, I don't know. I can find out how to do that, but I just want you to know I don't know how to do that now. And they hired me. And I asked Dave, still keep in touch with Dave 2 years later, or a year later after leaving that job. But I'm like, hey man, why did you guys hire me? Like I spoke to him probably a month or two after I got familiar with everybody, and he's like, you didn't lie, and you seemed eager to learn, and I was, and I didn't lie. And I said, do people really lie that much? And he's like, you would not believe what people say they can do. And as somebody in the field, I think he'd been in the field 3-4 years, and the physicist, um, he'd been in the field for 10, 15 years. They see right through it. Or they'll ask you one question about it and you're like, yeah, you say you know something, just don't lie. Just be eager to learn. Tell them you want to learn it. Tell them it, and hopefully that's true, that you do want to learn it. But yeah, just don't tell them something that you don't know. That's going to be a hard stop for any employer, I think. So
Yeah, yeah. That's great advice. Don't lie in your interviews. You know, uh, Definitely think of beforehand. Scenarios that you've been in or things that you've done that are awesome, right? That are kind of the top, maybe the top few things that you've done in your career, so that you're prepared with those examples and how they could relate to different scenarios. But definitely don't lie. Even as a director, when I was doing interviews, one of the one of the key ways that you could tell if somebody is lying is and we'll get to this question here in a second. But one of the key ways that people could tell that you're lying, that I was able to tell that people were lying, is they will ramble about it forever and not actually hit the answer. So,
what is that? That's a thing when even like I think you've probably seen it with Sophie. They over explain.
yeah,
Sorry.
don't.
But
So we've got a question. Tell us a little bit about what your tech stack is that you use.
so starting out, it was just React. What was it? It was the MERN stack, which I think it was React. I don't even remember what it stands for anymore. But React front end. It was just HTML, CSS, and React, with some vanilla JavaScript thrown in there. Now I've got experience with React, Angular, Vue 2, not Vue 3. I guess it's a little different. And then experience with Postgres, experience with Coginity has like 4 Postgres, experience with Python, a little experience with R, not a lot, but a little bit experience with that. And then some experience with what was it, the EKS pipelines, and kind of working with that, shell scripts, and how a little bit with Docker. So
Let me
which
just
yeah,
sorry for interrupting. Just for those of you that maybe don't know, EKS is
oh, sorry.
Kubernetes, is the elastic Kubernetes. So just wanted to touch that just in case there's somebody out there that didn't know. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so and those are going to be your like biggest things, as if you're getting into web development, your biggest things right now are going to be React and Angular. Vue is coming up, but not as close. And then actually the newest role that I'm going to take on is jQuery, with vanilla JavaScript, and It'll eventually transition over to Angular is what they told me, but yeah, big fan of React. Angular is cool because it's kind of out of the box, has everything baked in. But Angular is a little, I think, has a different learning curve. But Angular does things that React doesn't do, and that's another thing when you'll talk with employers or you'll meet with the client, and you may have to figure out. You may not be starting out figuring out what stack you want to use or what stack you're going to use. But that is part of being a software engineer, is figuring out what language is best for your product, and you have to figure that out. Unless you're project manager, unless you have like a stack that your company uses strictly. So
That's awesome. Great question. Thank you. All right. So I wanted to touch on a couple of these last questions as we kind of approach the top of the hour here. But how has the job market treated you as a veteran in tech? Tell me about maybe pros or cons, the things either on either side of that.
that first job I got a couple years ago now, that having experience in the military kind of filled the gap that I didn't have the degree. And that's what the hiring manager had said. He said, we know you don't have a degree. That's not a requirement for our job. It is for others, but not this one. But and the guy that interviewed me said, it's not a requirement that you get a degree. Anybody can sit in a classroom for 4 years. It's the what did he say? It's part of being able to stay consistent during that and learn, and then also produce that information, um, or recreate that information. So I don't have a comp sci degree or computer science degree, but having experience in some field kind of helps me out. So and it will help you, I guess, if you did have the degree. You're able to do those. What is it? Kind of spacing on. You can do those not on the job, but you can kind of intern, at some places, and that'll help you get a job. Whereas being a vet, I kind of just had to find those jobs, or you could intern at some places. But being a vet, I think it helps with government jobs because it'll give you a little leg up. If somebody with the exact same resume, other than the veteran experience, came along, they might hire me, but it may not have. It may not. So I would say it helps a little bit.
Very cool. Have you experienced, whether it be maybe people that you work with or employers that didn't look as positively on your experience in the Navy?
Up front, no, and I don't know. That's people's political outlook. Maybe some employers may not like that. Some employers might. To my face, no, I could never tell. If somebody didn't or did like the veteran, kind of background. I think it would be looked down on if somebody did. I'm not trying to beef up veterans or anything like that, but I think that'd be kind of a bad look for them if they did, kind of look down on that. So at least to my face, no, I've never seen it turn away people. So
awesome. So we've talked about a lot of things at this point. Where do you see yourself going in the next 5 to 10 years as a software engineer?
So I eventually kind of wanted to be a project manager, PM, whatever you want to call it. Because I think, but right now I want to be well-rounded software engineer. I want to get into app development more. I still need to keep up to date with current tech stacks and everything, because React just came out with a new update, I think within the last 6 months, that was fairly large. Angular is always coming out with new packages and new updates, and Vue as well. And then back end, Python's your king right now, probably. I think Python or maybe C# now, something like that. But it's always changing. So I want to be a project manager eventually, because I think I talk well with people. I think I could talk well with the client, and take on that role, take on that kind of like hat. But right now, I just want to be a software engineer. I just want to code. I want to work with clients. I don't mind talking with people. I love working in a team. So right now, 3 to 5 years, maybe mid to senior level, hopefully software engineer. So.
Awesome. So we've got a question from the audience. How did you get a job in the current job market? So I know that you mentioned just recently you're getting ready to start a new contract.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that journey over the last few months for you, knowing that your previous contract was going to end, and gaining this new contract that you have come into.
Yeah. So up until probably this most recent round of interviews over the last couple months, I'd only interviewed maybe 2 or 3 times, and getting one of those roles, it was because I knew somebody, or one of them was LinkedIn. I would say use all your resources you can. LinkedIn has helped me a ton. Knowing people has helped a little. I know they always say it's not what you know, it's who you know. In this market, it can help. It definitely can help. But in this market, you need to beef up the resume. You need to get on LinkedIn, get all over, put your resume everywhere, and don't be discouraged by the no replies. Don't be discouraged by the no's. I went through, because I had only gone through three or four interviews before this most recent role, but I had 8 or 9 interviews over the last 2 months, and it was exhausting. Thinking, going on a Thursday or Friday or Wednesday and thinking the interview went so well, and then realizing they still didn't want you, and you're like, I really crushed that interview. I think this will be good, and then it's so discouraging, being like, oh, we're gonna go with somebody else. It's like, okay, well. So don't be discouraged. As a fresher, taking on the job market. Sorry, I didn't mean to take over.
No, you're good. You jump right to that. I want to just, for those of you that are just joining, be sure to pop your questions in the chat. But yeah, what's your take on the job market for a fresher, for somebody just entering the career force?
It's hard for everybody right now, but it's even harder for freshers because I hate to say that, but I think when I started, it had just come off of COVID, so people were starting to go back into the office, and that's what helped me, was willing to go into the office. Now, a lot of jobs, I think, be willing to go into the office, and that already gives you a leg up. Apply for jobs that are hybrid, full in office, and you're going to have to get that experience somehow. But full remote, like I said, it's really competitive out there. I only got lucky with this one being full remote because they, just right time when I applied. But I applied for 3 or 4 roles where I went into the office and it was going to be full in office, but I was willing to, because, I still need to get that experience. And people with 3 to 5 years experience are still having difficulty finding roles, but be willing to go into the office and continually learn and beef up your personal projects, and that'll hopefully help you out.
Yeah. These are some great questions. And I want to add on to that. When you're interviewing, if you're interviewing for a hybrid role, letting them know that you're willing to come into the office more than maybe is required for that hybrid role it may also give you a leg up. Just because I think that some companies will put things out as a hybrid role, really wanting that full in-person experience, but they want to widen their net. So being able to go in and say, hey, I know that it's hybrid, but I'm good with coming in more often as well. So putting that out there sometimes will make a difference as well, because a lot of people, especially coming off of COVID and these last several years where there is such a pushback of RTO, right? People don't want to return to the office. Being okay with returning to the office can sometimes be an advantage in the workforce.
I will say one thing: if you get an interview, and I had talked with you about this before, mentioning ChatGPT as a tool in your toolbox may or may not pan out in your favor. I've had discussions in the last 2 months of interviews where I would just, chat, or like I would just chat with people, in interviews, just talking. It would casually come up, AI, how do you feel about it? Oh, I use it all the time. Some employers don't like that. I had an interview that was a full remote position, full remote interview. 4 guys are sitting in the room, and the room went sour. It almost felt like when I said, "Oh, I would just use probably ChatGPT to, give me a decent line of code, and then I can, fit it in or something like that." Some people don't like that, and definitely don't tell them that you copy paste code into AI. Don't tell them. Don't tell them that. Don't do that. Well, I don't know. It depends on your workplace, but don't do that.
No, no, don't.
Especially not with
Don't do.
government work. Oh my god.
No, definitely not that. Yeah, for those of you that don't know, maybe or don't think about it, you copy and paste your code directly into ChatGPT. That, I mean, cool. Make sure that you don't have any proprietary information. Make sure that there's no connection information in your code. Make sure that you don't have keys or any type of secrets in your
Yeah.
code that that you don't want to share with the world.
Yeah.
If it's not something that you would post on Facebook and share with the world, probably don't just blindly paste it into ChatGPT. But yeah, that's a good point, Joe. Bringing that up in a interview setting, just be careful with it. Maybe go out. I think that would be a new good research topic as you're researching the company that you're going to, is see if you could find an article or some information about how they feel about AI. If you're going into a startup, like, it's probably okay. It's probably cool to mention that. If you're going into a government contract, maybe not so much. So be cognizant of what you're applying for and the atmosphere that you're in when you're discussing AI, and adjust your response accordingly. That's an awesome point. We've had several new people join. If you have any specific questions, pop them in the chat. We're probably going to wrap up here in a couple minutes, but we're happy to answer any other questions if you have a few more minutes there, Joe.
Yeah. Another thing was leak code. I know a lot of people will, for backend and front end. I assume they also do SQL queries as well. You can use leak code. The only thing is, leak code. I've never used something that I've seen on leak code in work. I've only got 2 years of experience, so maybe that's not everyone's experience. But if I sit here, hey, can you repeat these numbers from a string put into this function, and I wanted to spit out the name of whoever shot Kennedy, it's like, that's somebody could probably leak code doesn't make you a good programmer, doesn't make you a good software engineer, it doesn't make you good at anything other than leak code.
Right.
Or maybe if somebody is in a coding interview, and I've froze up in coding interviews before. I'm like, this should be easy. And if I would have spent maybe a few hours on leak code, maybe this would have panned out. So it can help you. Don't rely on it to be, your saving grace as being a good software engineer or software developer or whatever. So
that's great advice. It's what skills should I know for getting into data engineering field? I'm gonna jump on this question here real quick. I think Joey, you've even touched on this a little bit as we've had this conversation of, still SQL is the king, right, for data. It doesn't matter what you're doing. SQL's not going away, and that's the biggest skill that I would encourage anybody to gain. What I think, even for software engineers, having some knowledge and at least basic concepts of SQL. I know that you and I have had that conversation in the past. Is good to have.
Yeah,
so that's the number one thing. And I could that's a conversation I could take for a while, but I might reach out to you later and give you some additional resources too.
Yeah, SQL's helped me out a lot. There's different forms. I've used PostgreSQL, but it definitely is a good asset, not asset, but like experience to have. So
yeah. So we got a new question here. Can you share any skills from your Navy experience that have proven unexpectedly useful in your career?
Um, Unexpectedly useful. I would say, those soft skills were definitely expectedly useful. Unexpectedly, um, that AED experience being a corpsman could have been unexpectedly useful. No, but it kind of boiled down to just like if you have experience in any other job, it kind of helps you mesh with your current coworkers. You have stories, you have experience. Um, I would share, I didn't have any crazy stories from the military, but I would, like, oh yeah, we used to, oh, I've been down to Norfolk, I did this. It helps you network, it helps you talk with people. Um, and that's probably the biggest thing that was unexpected. Like, sharing experience with other people kind of like helps you mesh, helps you grow as a team, I think. Um, I'm trying to think what else would have been useful. It's not like I'm, running through the office or, trying to, save people. Or maybe I talk about like what I know about healthcare, like, oh man, I fell and bruised my knee. What should I do? Oh, you should rest, ice, compression, elevation. There you go. Unexpected in the
Yeah,
office. There you
yeah,
go. So yeah.
there you go. Uh, I think that yeah. What about kind of the leadership skills that you may have learned?
Yeah, so actually, yeah, unexpectedly, you know, giving orders, and that almost sounds bad, giving somebody orders, telling somebody in a role what to do, um, and maybe they give you pushback, or it gives you a good take on how to become a decent leader. I don't know how to be a great leader. I think I could be a decent one or a good one.
That comes with
But
experience.
working with people with different backgrounds, different experience, different skill sets, knowing which people are better at positioned for a certain job, but also being able to take orders from people that may be younger than you, maybe have less experience than you, but willing to, it's setting your pride aside or whatever, and
Yep.
you're working towards a common goal. They're not taking food out of my mouth by telling me what to do and them not doing it, or delegating orders or delegating what to do, like in software. Um, but it's helpful to do. I've had people that don't have as good of personal skills, very, very smart individuals, but don't have good people skills. And they tell you maybe in a rude way that they want something done. And, you're like, okay, I'll get it done, but you have to set that aside. Like you're working towards a common goal. It's not personal. It's just, you got to do stuff. And I did that in the Navy too. You know, People aren't always having the best day, or maybe you're not having the best day, but you have to set that aside and kind of, go to work. So, and I'm not saying don't have boundaries. That's completely
Boundaries.
different,
Yeah.
completely different. But, willing to just set that little pride aside and just go to work. So,
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, does anybody have any final questions that they might want to ask Joey while we've got his full attention here? Be sure to pop
yeah.
those in the chat, or any comments at all.
And we can do this again sometime.
Impacted your business or organization. Um, and I think I could probably touch on this, but I think that for you, Joe, the maybe explain it, because I actually know that you had a data problem, because I think that you and I talked about it.
I think, I think we did. I think it was, it had something to do with our databases. We had like a training, or not a training database, a dev database, a developing database, and then we had our production database. But in our application, we wanted to, it was in production. So it was using production database, data. But we wanted to test a new page in the application using dev database data. But the way we had our connection set up with the engine, it was only connected to one. You couldn't hook up to both.
Well, yeah,
So it was kind of difficult to do, and we tried it out, but you're not always going to have a perfect solution. You may have to work around in some areas in software. And I'm not saying, kind of cowboy code or, break one area to fix another, because that might happen too. But you kind of have to balance what you can kind of work with or tweak, to get something to work. So
I think that's a great answer. Understanding that sometimes you may not always have the perfect answer for every solution is important. Sometimes it is a good enough solution, right? Um, I know for me, um, yeah. Thank you, Doreen. Uh, Doreen popped in here real quick. Not lying on the resume. Um, yeah, can't tell you. Doreen's actually one of my mentees, so she's. Thank you, Doreen, for popping on and and commenting. But yeah, going back to not lying. I actually think that both these questions and comments feed into each other here. Don't lie on your resume, and don't lie about your ability to fix something that may
yeah.
be broken. Be modest enough to let people know when you need help.
Yes.
Uh, I think that having that humility of reaching out for help. Don't just keep on plugging away at it for hours, especially if it is a production issue. Make sure that especially for whether it be a complex data problem, um, or something's down as far as the software piece. Reach out for help. Don't feel like you have to do it alone. So oftentimes, especially as data engineers and software engineers that may have worked remotely for years and years. You might feel like you have to do it all on your own and carry the whole load. You don't. Reach out to your peers. Somebody is there to help you. Don't feel like if you reach out to your boss and say, "Hey, I don't know. I'm stuck. I don't know how to fix this." Like they're gonna fire you because you asked a question, right? So I think that reaching out for help is super important. It shows that you are humble and shows that you don't have this huge ego. So I think that's important. And as far as having a complex data problem that I solved, I, there's been so many over the years. It's hard to pick just one. But um, recently, I've had to integrate Zoom call information into a database, and the API didn't have the data that I needed in the way that I needed it, right? Ended up having to use a webhook and building some Azure functions to pull data or to have the data push from that webhook into an ADLS bucket, and then use that information to bounce against the information I pulled from the API so that I can narrow down the scope of what shows up on the reporting. Um, for this particular case, there were calls that were coming in that were kind of spam calls, and the queue filtered out those calls. But in the API data, they all came through. Everything showed up, and we couldn't tell which were filtered out and didn't hit the queue and which weren't. So having that additional webhook data is what we needed to combine with it um, in order to get the reporting that we needed and the analysis that we needed for that. So um, that was a little bit. It's not super complex, but and I know I ran through it in about 30 seconds or a minute, but it was definitely more complex than it may have sounded. Just having to figure out how that data related and where it was. Reaching back out to the vendor for the API and having those conversations of, hey, I can't find this on your API. I don't know where it's at. Can you help me? They may tell you up front that they don't have it. Depending on your contract with that vendor, they may be willing to build out an API that has that information. They may be able to redirect you to something like a webhook that maybe they don't have well documented that they have available. So again, that goes back into feel good about being humble and reaching out. Don't keep on plugging away at something. What's your experience with that, Joe?
I was actually going to touch on that. So I still struggle with this is admitting when I can't figure something out or taking too much time to figure out a problem. When I first started, it would probably take me what somebody might have known if I would have just reached out to somebody, maybe just across like the hall or in a cubicle next to me, you know, hey, how do you do XYZ? And they're like, oh, you just do this, this, this. And I'm like, oh, okay. Where I could have done that, it took me days to figure something out because I was too worried about somebody real thinking that I wasn't good at this job or that I would get fired or, and that comes back to imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And I still struggle with that.
Yep.
I don't, or maybe you don't want to bother somebody or you don't want to feel dumb or just set that aside. You're all working towards a similar goal. And if Jim from accounting thinks you're dumb for asking a question that you don't know, then that's Jim's problem. That's not yours. Because then you just learned something and you just figured something out that otherwise might have taken you longer than, maybe necessary. But yeah, in interviews, they ask you, what's your strength? What's your greatest weakness? That's my answer for my greatest weakness. I take on more than I can figure out. And then I take too long to figure things out. And it's gotten better, you know, I had a complex problem in the software application we were building out. We updated a few packages, didn't know they weren't compatible with other packages, but there were no errors saying that they weren't, so it wouldn't build in the pipeline. Pushed it to SAT and it worked. Pushed it to prod, wouldn't work. Couldn't figure out why, and the packages were different in the branches. So, or maybe it was dev with SAT, but anyway, there were no errors coming out, so it just wouldn't build. Nothing was wrong in the logs. We looked through the Elasticsearch, everything. Could not figure out what was going on. And luckily, the other guy on my team went line by line and reverted back every single package and finally figured it out. And you're going to get that. Some packages are not going to be compatible with others, and it's ever evolving. Whereas you have 100 different packages in your front or back end, and one gets updated, maybe it's not compatible with 97 of them, or maybe not compatible with one. So then you have to figure out, you have to plug and play. You're like, okay, is the benefit of not having this one updated worth, changing this one and this and this? And it gets hairy, but yeah.
I think that's a good argument for Docker. It's and having that consistent environment of which packages you have in your environment, which ones don't, because that's a good point. Sometimes a package updates in any of the platforms that you have, whether it be Python or another package, or another programming language, libraries and packages update, and then all of a sudden it breaks something
Yes.
that's been working fine for a decade. So I think it's a good argument for Docker. But yeah, I think. Go ahead.
I've seen it happen plenty of times in Python where you update pandas, and let's say versions 0 through 3.1.3 use one way of saying something or doing something, and they upgrade to 3.2, and they're like, "Oh, we've deprecated this. We no longer use this. You have to start using this." And you have that line in 100 different files. You're like, "Okay, great. Now I got to go to work." At least that, at least they tell you, that they're changing things. But sometimes those packages do not work well with others. So,
I know we're way over. We're starting to get a little bit of a following here, and start to have a little bit more questions. Do you have maybe until the middle of the hour to
yeah,
chat?
yeah.
Okay.
I might get some water, but
Yeah. Been talking for a bit. So for those of you that Joey stepped away for a minute, but for those of you that are just joining, Joey was a corpsman in the Navy. He went into software engineering. So we're just kind of talking through his career transitions and kind of have ventured into how data engineering and software engineering kind of cross over a lot in between, and the importance as a software engineer understanding a bit of the data side, as well as I think it's also equally important for data engineers to have at least a concept of what software engineers do. I think again, as a data engineer, I work with software engineers now that to get them the data that they need, and understanding how they're going to take that data and move forward with it is super important. I think that working together is important. I think that working don't work in the silo, and make sure that you're having those conversations with the other stakeholders on your project, other people working on the project, to understand what their needs are of the piece that you're working on. Um, but also want to say, we've had some awesome questions. I really appreciate the conversations. If those For those of you that are still out there, if you have any specific questions for either one of us, pop them in the chat. We're happy to have that conversation with you. And again, thank you all for joining and spending this time with us. I know I've really enjoyed it, Joey. I hope
You had a great, no, it was a great time. I've never done this before, so this was great. I was going to say too, learning the last couple of years, I've learned obviously more in the last couple of years than I ever could have in a boot camp, but learning, being willing to learn other things or look at the back end or look at the front end. Like, let's say you're a back end engineer and you are not, you want to kind of, familiarize yourself, or you're a data engineer and you want to talk with your software engineers, like, hey, how do you want this data to come out? Or how do you want this laid out? And I've been asked that, I think within the first few months I was at my first role. It's like, hey, for the application we're building, like you're building out, how do you want your data? And I was like, what do you mean? How do I want my data? I just want the data. And they're like, no. Do you want it, we're going to put it in a dictionary or a dict or whatever, and then we're going to send it to the front end. How do you want it to look? Do you want it organized like this, or do you want it, in one big string, which is just line by line? And I didn't know. I was like, can you just tell me how I need my data?
Right.
So,
Right.
but now I know a little more, how do I want this data to come out? How do I manipulate this data? But I would have never known that if I would have stuck to only my skill set. Don't be afraid to talk to other people about their job. If you have the time, or you guys are just sitting around like the water cooler or whatever, or maybe you're on a Zoom call and you guys are like figuring out one problem and you're like, hey, do you have like 5 minutes to tell me what this line of code does in your code base? I'm just generally curious, and you might learn something and it might help you later. So
I think to that point, especially as the data field has evolved over time, there was a time that so much of data was just SQL and SSIS packages, um, and not a whole lot of maybe programming. But it has really evolved a lot. We, as a data engineer, I use so much. I use Python so much now than I ever used before, and historically I'd used VB.net. And kind of gone that route when I was younger in my career. But with Python being such a big thing and so versatile, having those conversations, I think, with your software engineers, especially if you get stuck on something in Python, getting that different perspective of how another skill set does things is huge. I think that it's super important to don't limit yourself when you get stuck. Don't limit yourself to the other data professional sitting beside you. Reach out to other people that maybe have a different perspective because they use the platform or use the programming language a little bit differently than you do. They may give you an insight that you may never have thought of. But yeah, and I think that as a fresher going into the business, for a software engineer, for maybe a front end or a back end dev, that you don't know what you don't know until you know it, right? It's you, there, all of a sudden you're having those conversations will really open your mind and broaden your perspective. So.
And coming from your field and mine, I guarantee we look at code different ways. We analyze it different ways. Getting that perspective definitely helps out a lot. And I'm not saying everybody has to look at every bit of code everywhere and figure it out and want to learn. By all means, hone your craft. Stick to your where you're at and get really good at it. But don't be afraid to like look at other things and maybe go down a little rabbit hole in maybe C# and learn, like, I don't know, if something happens like that, or the different language, so because it may help you.
Absolutely. All right, well, I think people are starting to dwindle a little bit, but If you do have any final questions, be sure to pop them in the chat. Let us know what you got. We'll probably wrap it up here in the next 5 minutes and let Joey get on with his day here.
I had a great time doing this. Yeah, I start my new job Monday. And I'm learning a new language there. You know, I've been hired for 2 different positions now over the last couple of years where I didn't know the language, but you know other languages, and it helps you because it's all, it's all pretty similar.
It is.
For now. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great message and a great point too. You know, it goes back to the conversation we had earlier about if you don't fit every part of a job rec, go ahead and apply for it.
Don't say you know it and don't know it, but
yeah.
But yeah, by all means, apply for something. Yeah.
So, if you don't mind me asking, what's the new language that you're going to be learning in your new role?
It's jQuery, which is just
you mentioned that.
Yeah, it's kind of like a shorthand vanilla JavaScript. I don't remember when it was made, but jQuery, and then we're going to use D3 in the front end, and I'm going to help out with the back end a little bit here and there. And they liked that when they heard that. They're like, hey, if somebody's out, and working on back end, would you be able to do you know what you're looking at? And I was like, oh, it's a built-in. They're like, oh, Python. Like, yeah, I know what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
But maybe if it was built in like C# or C++ or something like that, I may not know, but I wasn't going to lie about that. But anyway, yeah, with jQuery and D3, D3 is another library built on JavaScript that builds out graphs. If you've ever worked in government work, they like graphs a lot. Yeah. Because you want to be able to open application and see, they want the big pretty picture to see what's up. And I get it. I like that too. Tell me what's up. Show me the data right away. I don't want all numbers. Show me on a graph. Yeah. So
I had a boss early on that told me that people don't care what your data is if it doesn't look pretty. And I think that holds true. People don't. If you can't make your data look pretty, it may not be the message that they want. So that I just want to clarify that that's not what I'm talking about. But if you don't have it formatted in a way that is aesthetically attractive, then people are not going to see your data and not see your application, not care anything about it. So making things look pretty is part of it. I know that sounds kind of maybe a little demeaning or understating it, but it is. You could have all the greatest information and code in the world. If you don't make your presentation level look pretty, people are not going to look at it and not going to hear the message.
Yeah. I've also looked at code bases, not even the end product, and it looks like a mess. That's a whole nother conversation, but
that is
documentation, code bases, spacing, lines, and there's some languages that don't require, like semicolons at the end of your lines, and there's some that do, and the people that like the semicolons hate that they don't require them in the other one, and vice versa.
Yeah.
It's all.
Are you kidding? That's what I like about Python, is that I don't have to put semicolons in there.
Hey, the bumpers are on. Yeah, and so I like the training wheels. I don't need it. Just throw these lines everywhere. So
I'll say that the nice thing about Python that you don't necessarily have in some of the other programming languages is that it forces you to have correct indentation.
Yes.
To that point, I think that as you're writing code, whether it be SQL or Python or C# or whatever, Java or JavaScript, proper formatting or consistent formatting, it makes your code so much more readable. I can't enforce enough how important it is to correctly or at least have a consistent formatting practice.
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah, I've looked at people's code and they probably look at mine and think the same thing, like, this is a mess. I've looked at code that I made 6 months prior. I'm like, what was I doing? What in the world? And
I was going to make that same comment. You look back at something you did 6 months or even 3 years ago and you're like, who did this? And all of a sudden you realize, oh crap, that was
Oh,
me.
yeah.
I did that. What was I thinking? But yeah, so yeah, I'll also say that there are tools out there that will help you with formatting if that's
Yeah.
something that you struggle with.
Mhm.
You could get some pretty print plug-in for just about any code that you have that will help you with your formatting. But
yeah, prettier I think is in JavaScript. In VS Code, at least prettier I think it's called.
prettier, yep.
Be careful with that though. It will also prettier your JSON if you have a JSON file somewhere, or at least it did before in mine. And I was like, oh man, now I gotta fix this. So
it makes it easy to read, but yeah, that's not the format that you want necessarily saving it always. Not for JSON strings at least. Cool. Well, and Joey, thanks for coming on. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave everybody with, or for those of you that are on, do you have any final questions for Joey or I before we let you all get back to your days?
best of luck in the job search for anybody out there. It's ever evolving. So just take the punches as they come. So and don't take the no's as discouraging. Just because they didn't want you doesn't matter. That's their problem.
Yeah, I think it's a easier said than done kind of message. It is discouraging. I know you've been there. Heck, I've been there. So we've all been there where we get the no's, or we get just ghosted sometimes by recruiters. And don't take that personally. It's not even always that they didn't want you. You don't know if all of a sudden the funding fell through for something, or the posting closed and didn't get filled because the org decided to have some type of financial cutback. Especially as we're moving into kind of this last quarter of the year, keep in mind that for a lot of companies, for their fourth fiscal quarters, they pull back on funding. Something that posted last month that should have still been open will all of a sudden close just because we start going into this next year funding season. And so don't feel bad if all of a sudden you applied for something, maybe you start the process and all of a sudden you get ghosted, or you get a auto reject email. If you see it pop back up in January, know that it was probably because the funding fell through for that role, whether that be an internal role, an external role, or a contract position. It's that happens this time of year. Awesome. Well, Joey, thank you so incredibly much for doing this with me today. I hope
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I hope that our audience got a lot out of it. And I'd like to also thank the audience for asking questions and it being a much more interactive session as we got into it. So thank you, and I'll let everybody get back to their day. Thanks, guys.